Let me get this straight. You worked your bum off for months and you saved up all of your pennies and you went and bought that nice, fancy digital camera with all those settings and modes, and you're only going to use the M for manual mode because some random people on the internet said you're not a pro if you use the other ones? I used to think like this, especially when I moved from only shooting film to my first ever digital camera, but newsflash, I was being silly, and being stubborn about only ever shooting in manual mode wasn't just unnecessary, it was actively making me a worse photographer, and I bet you're making the same mistake. Now that I'm a much more experienced photographer and like human being, I've learned that a lot of the advice we hear about manual mode is just wrong and comes from a pretty gatekeepy place, in my opinion. We'll get into that later, as well as a little myth busting, but for now, let me explain why I am begging you to use this dial more often, starting with the one that will upset the snobs the most. Auto. There's a reason auto mode is green, because it's easy and it lets you just go and take photos. Think about it, if you want to be a photographer, what's the first thing above all else that you need to go and practice and make a habit out of? Spoiler alert, it's not focus stacking or spot metering or using masks in Lightroom. It's leaving your crusty ass bedroom to go take photos. I don't care how advanced a technique is, it's not going to help if you're not going to take photos. That is step one, day one, as basic as it gets, and if you're not doing that, you won't ever get better, and if auto mode helps you do that, then use auto mode. But what about when you've spent some time practicing just taking photos and now you have an idea of what you want and you want to take a little more control? This is my camera, it's a Nikon D750, and on this camera there are 23 buttons, 10 modes, and 6 drive modes, and all of that gets very confusing very quickly. It's overwhelming, especially if you're learning, and it's not just me saying that. I recently got an email from a subscriber, hi Zach, who said, I'm having trouble figuring out when I need to adjust my shutter speed, aperture, and ISO to get my lighting to work. The Canon Rebel T7 I'm working with has modes to manually set everything and modes to let just one of the three auto adjust, and I'm completely lost when it comes to choosing between them. Now I use manual mode a lot, but I also use the auto modes a lot, and what mode I choose depends a lot about what I care about. Let me explain with examples. When I go to shoot portraits, all I really care about is that I'm controlling the depth of field, how much is in focus. I know that I want the photo to be correctly exposed, but I don't care if that's done with ISO 200 or ISO 2000, or 1/125th of a second or 1/500th of a second. So because I care about the depth of field only, I take control of that by using A for aperture priority mode, and I let the camera decide on the shutter speed and the ISO. In fact, I shoot aperture priority a lot. I really care about having deep focus almost all of the time, so if I'm just taking the dog for a walk or going to the shops, that's generally the mode I leave my camera in. But if I'm taking photos of, say, I don't know, race cars, I know that I need to control my shutter speed, but I don't really care about any of the other stuff since it's not going to dramatically change my results anyway. Now you might think I would want to control the aperture also to have more stuff in focus, but when I shoot race cars, I am changing my shutter speeds constantly and by a lot, so having the camera automatically sort everything else out makes sense. So for race cars, I use shutter priority, which is sometimes called TV for time value. You can also use shutter priority the other way around. If you want to do some fancy artsy-fartsy motion blurry stuff, then you know that you care about having a low shutter speed, like 1/30th, but you don't really care about your aperture or ISO. One thing you really should care about is how slow your shutter is, which is why I've teamed up with Framer, the sponsor of today's video, to build you a reference guide for slow shutter photography. Framer is an awesome tool for making and publishing websites, and I used it to build slowshutterspeeds.com, where you can browse through a gallery of examples of different slow shutter photos with the exact settings I used. Now, Framer, just like your camera, can do everything for you on auto, or you can take full manual control and get really nerdy with its advanced tools. Now, I'm a much better photographer than I am web designer, so I checked out Framer's massive library of templates, and I picked out one that was nice and minimal and good for photos. I did take some control though. I went in and I adjusted the fonts and the colors and things like that just to make it feel a bit more me. I uploaded my photos, and then I typed in what I wanted to say. The whole process is so streamlined and easy, I felt like a wizard But Framer isn't just quick and easy to make, it works, it loads really fast, it works perfectly on mobile, and whenever I need to update stuff, it's super easy. If you're a manual mode only person, don't worry, because Framer has that covered too, with advanced analytics features, A/B testing, and even localization so that you can share your ideas with people all over the planet. You really have no excuse not to build a portfolio for your photos or a landing page for your ideas this weekend, so click the link in the video description to sign up to Framer and get 25% off your first 3 months. A massive thank you to Framer and to you for supporting what I do. But what if I care about more and I want to control more? When I'm out doing street photography, I know that I don't want any motion blur and I want really deep focus, which means I care about my shutter speed and my aperture, so manual mode it is, with a twist. I also care about having a correct exposure, and unless I'm getting artsy-fartsy, that almost always just means the exposure that my camera sees as correct. So inside manual mode, I turn on auto ISO. I think manual mode with auto ISO is probably my favorite way to use a camera above all, because it gives me control over everything I care about and nothing I don't. If it's too dark for the settings that I want to use, I would by default push the ISO up before changing anything else anyway, so it's pretty much just the camera on cruise control. In fact, the only times I ever use manual ISO nowadays are when I'm in a studio and I have full control over everything, when I'm using flash, and when I'm shooting something that I know will mess with the light meter. Think dark streets at night or snowy landscapes. The camera doesn't know what it's looking at, it just knows that it needs to make the photo medium bright, but if I want it to be really bright or not bright at all, then I have to take matters into my own hands and use manual ISO. Like how you can take matters into your own hands by clicking on the subscribe button somewhere down there. When I photograph with this what do I care about approach, it unlocks a couple of things. For starters, when I don't particularly care about what shutter speed I'm using, for example, I would be manually setting my shutter based on what the light meter in my camera says anyway, and so instead of using my brain as the algorithm, I can just use the cameras. And when you free up your brain juice from thinking about camera settings, you can use more brain juice on setting, as in where you are, who's in front of the camera, when is that decisive moment, and how will you tell the story? How could you move around the shoot to find interesting angles? How could you create depth or move in a way that makes the light more interesting? What's happening around the photo that you can see now and what's going to happen in the next 30 seconds? I don't think that being a human textbook of correct camera usage makes you a great artist. Making great art does, and I don't think it matters that much how you get there. I think getting snooty about auto modes is kind of the equivalent of telling painters that they're not real artists because they're using pre-made paint in a tube instead of formulating their own custom versions of red, blue, and yellow. As well as freeing me up to think about the photo more, it also frees me up to just be. Like, yes, sometimes I leave the house with the express intention of going to take photos, but sometimes I just want to go to a cafe and take my camera with me just in case. And when I'm documenting life, I do not want to be thinking about camera settings. I want to be thinking about life. So if that's true, how come there's a load of grumpy, middle-aged photographers who think it's all bollocks and that manual mode is the only way? Well, shooting in manual mode does give you full control over what the camera is doing and therefore what the photos will look like. If you're a professional photographer and people's money is on the line, it's kind of silly to use anything else. And I think that's where some of the confusion starts. See, most people who take photos and enjoy photography are not professional photographers, just like most people who cook aren't professional chefs. And those grumpy professionals have been professionals for much longer than I have, and that's done two things. It's cemented their ways of working completely into their brains, so when somebody does something else, it just registers to them as wrong, like if somebody started playing a song that you know but in a different key.
Straight away wrong.
But it's also made them jaded. Pro photography is a dog-eat-dog industry, and over the last decade there's been a lot less demand for photographers. So naturally, these photographers that get grumpy about manual mode are probably feeling disillusioned about their careers. They feel like they're being replaced by technology. And in a very real sense, they are. Darkrooms and film labs used to be a massive industry that employed loads of people in every town. Now, it's a much more niche thing. And just like video killed the radio star, iPhones are killing the DSLR, and I think that that's a shame. Go find an old copy of Life magazine at a flea market or a thrift store and just look at how beautiful it is compared to the website now. That's because, as well as loads of print designers, layout designers, and illustrators, a lot of photographers lost their jobs when magazines went digital, and photo essays became Jimmy from Arkansas with his iPhone. Now, I bet you were expecting me to blame the manual mode snobbery on bitter boomers who are insecure in their masculinity and have to assert their place in the hierarchy whenever possible. And sure, there are some people like that, but I think complaining about it doesn't help anything, it doesn't make anything better, it leads to more generational conflict and doesn't make anybody a better artist. Instead, I think it's a much better approach to lead with curiosity, openness, and generosity. So next time a photographer gives you trouble about shooting an auto, ask to see their photos. If they're being a twit, it'll be pretty obvious pretty quickly, but they might just have a shoebox full of prints in their sock drawer that they never got to show anyone, and there might just be something you can learn from them. Now, you might be wondering, if I use auto ISO all the time, what if it's really dark and the ISO starts to get really high, like 12,800 high? Surely I would want to step in and stop it from being too noisy, right? Well, no. I'll explain when you watch this video next about why it's much less of a problem than you think it is. Stay hydrated and create art.